Oh, I've forgotten how to use this thing. Been so long.
You're out of practice, John.
Yes, I
All
am.
right. We've got folks in the room here at CRC. Sorry for the background noise. Jim, I'll just let you take it away. Hopefully you can share your slides. And if not, I can pull them up. Just let me know. Thanks for being here, everyone.
But I take it that's a take it away. We're ready to go. Okay. Okay. Well, let me just see first if I can get these slides to show up. Can we see the slides? Okay. Well, thanks. I think I know most of you, if not many of you at least, and kind of appreciate the opportunity to spend an hour or so and walk through my experience and background in mineland reclamation. But also, we're going to talk about geomorphic reclamation, specifically more towards the end of the presentation. Um, but I do appreciate the opportunity, knowing many of you, as well as sharing a lot of background in this subject with some of you, like Paul Hawks, etc. Now, if I can only get things to work. Okay. For you, those of you that don't know me, I was born in Butte, Montana, and kind of in a way have mining in my blood, whether I like it or not, is the way I oftentimes think of it. Butte being a place that today has been recognized as one of the largest Superfund sites in the United States, as well as a very large area where I and Sarah and other folks have been involved in reclamation over the years. I always like to kind of try to explain to folks how I ended up in the odd situation I am, being a mining engineer who works for the folks that I do work for. And I have to blame it on my ancestors. I find it kind of convenient to do so, at least. Um, I had one grandfather that, as I say here, struck it rich in 1936 over by Whitehall. He and two other gentlemen mined a shaft at the Mary Ingeborg claim. Mining claims always have these interesting names. And they went down about 50 feet, got into a vein, shipped one carload of ore. And my grandfather probably did the smartest thing he ever did is he quit mining and went into construction. He only took up mining later in life, once again. But he actually made good money in construction, not in mining. But just as importantly, if not more so, I had another grandfather who was a Christian Reformed minister, had a very interesting background himself. But he taught me that there was more than one kind of gold and the value of other things other than what my other grandfather. So I kind of grew up in a dichotomy, as I oftentimes explain to folks. On top of all that, I ended up being raised in Utah. And when you're not an LDS or a Mormon in Utah, it really does set you apart. You learn a lot of things. I like this particular cartoon because, the idea that you live behind a fence, the Zion Curtain, that really was the way I felt growing up. I will tell you that it also emboldened me, though, to be different. And it was one of the reasons why I think I was dared kind of separate myself from the mining industry at some point. For those of you that don't know, I was heavily influenced and attended the Montana School of Mines in Butte. And then after I graduated in 1983, the best way I can describe myself is as a tramp engineer. A lot of folks know about tramp miners in the mining industry. Well, as an engineer, I wasn't really that different. Basically moved all over the different places. You can see a list of the different countries and states that I lived in. As you do that, if you want to progress up the ladder, you can do so. And that allowed me to actually become a mine manager, for example, at 31. Ended up being a consulting engineer after that. I've worked at little mines as well as the largest mines in the world and for the largest mining corporation. And it's really been quite interesting to work for such a diverse group of folks in the industry. But what happened is in 1995, I went on a walkabout, and I'll say it was a bit of a trying to deal with my conscience. of what I was doing as a mining engineer, what I was doing with my life. My wife definitely wanted to take the walk with me. Good thing she did. We came back to Montana in 1996, and I started Kuipers and Associates. And essentially, that's also when I met Northern Plains Resource Council and the various folks that work there. I think some of whom are probably on this call, certainly Paul, Jerry, a few others. When I first started, I thought I was going to do mine reclamation and mine closure. And the first job I got was the Pony Mine site. I haven't got any slides or any information on the Pony Mine site, but for those of you that don't know, it was a mining company who got a milling site next to a small town in southwestern Montana, the town of Pony. And essentially, the mining company wasn't really a mining company, but was a Chicago syndicate that was using the site to launder money. And they would essentially claim that they were producing lots of gold, had all kinds of equipment. Turned out nothing ran, and they were running somewhat of a scam. But they ended up building a big tailings facility next to town and left a big mess there. And I came back to Montana and cleaned that up. But then I began to work a whole different set of work that I'll talk about here. What I'm going to try to do is touch on kind of this whole world of what I refer to as mine land reclamation. You can see there's a whole bunch of different descriptors that we run into depending upon the circumstances, what goes on at various mine sites, ranging anywhere from the kind of Superfund remediation vernacular that you oftentimes hear in its brownfields associations. We also have things like PMLU instability, and you notice I've got that kind of in large letters with a bunch of others around it. That's the modern requirements for reclamation and kind of how they defined it in terms of various tasks and areas. But we also have aspects that oftentimes come up in conversations with Northern Plains folks that I've worked with. One of those being restoration. What is the idea of restoration and what do we do with restoration? I want to talk about that for a second. The idea of regeneration, which is something that, because Northern Plains folks work a lot with coal mines and work with situations where the mine lands actually may originally have been used primarily for grazing or for even farms or other purposes in some places, we get into discussions about regeneration. We also have things like community development, various other aspects. And then over here in the far left or right bottom, excuse me, we have geomorphic landform design. And really, it takes a lot of the things we're talking about here, but very importantly, puts in place something that I think is really important for engineers, and that's the whole process of listening to stakeholders. And if I kind of have to, when I sit back and think about what I've learned as an engineer working with Northern Plains, with other public interest groups and stakeholders, et cetera, a lot with tribes, it's that we do need to listen. And by listening, we can greatly improve reclamation. And so that's something you'll see, particularly when we get to geomorphic landform design. It's really a big integral part of that. But I think it's also something, as I say, that learning to listen and realizing as an active listener that the public in various forms can provide input that ultimately is very, very valuable to the end result. In fact, I would suggest it's necessary to that end result. So in 1997, one of the first projects I did, kind of not with the mining industry, was to get involved with the Fort Belknap Indian community, excuse me, and represent them with respect to the Zortman and Landusky mine cleanup. And for those of you that aren't familiar, that these mines are in kind of eastern central Montana. They stand up out of the plains. You can see the actual scars from the mines from 50 to 60 miles away as you're driving towards the mountains. The mines have a long history with the tribes, a lot of grievances and other things. I won't go into that right now. But one of the things that was going on was there had been a reclamation and closure plan set up initially in about 1980. And then when the mines went bankrupt in 1997, conditions at the mine were quite different. There was a lot of acid drainage, various features that had expected to be changed or completed or backfilled hadn't been done, various other aspects. Also, everything we knew about reclamation, and by we, I would say myself, as well as folks with the regulatory agencies, most people with the mining industry, About as much as far as we knew, we were out there reclaiming cornfields on mountainsides. And a lot of our practices reflected agricultural science and other aspects that we were trying to apply and didn't have a lot of experience. And so, as a consequence, if you look in detail, a lot of what's done here, it raises some eyebrows. But actually, simply getting people to shape the land rather than just plowing in various very straight landforms and other things, that was one of the major accomplishments we actually managed to get done at these two mines. Also managed to get good vegetation. However, this is a good example of where when you look at the vegetation, you're not going to see trees. And that's very intentional. All these pads have pads in terms of waste rock piles and our heap leach pads are acid generating. And the covers are actually intended to reduce infiltration going down into that acid generating material. If we grow trees, and particularly as those trees die or get uprooted through a windstorm, could burn or other things, it would compromise that cover. So this is a good example where this site, at least the plans that we presently have, that I think the agencies continue to have, is going to require pretty much maintenance in perpetuity, both for water treatment, but also just simply to maintain those covers. This is a Zortman mine, very similar situation there. One of the things you'll notice, though, is in reclaiming these mines, we actually managed to get a decent amount of backfill. About 50% of the open pit features, high walls, various other aspects were backfilled, and that wasn't part of the original plan. But in kind of optimizing the way we move dirt, using some of the money to do some things it wasn't originally intended to do, we were able to do that. When you go to a mine site like this, what you soon discover, particularly when you're taking it over, such as in a bankruptcy, is things aren't the way they're supposed to be. There was not supposed to be a pit lake at the Landusky mine, but there was a pit lake. And so we ended up having to backfill that. And there's been quite a history of backfilling of mines, particularly to deal with pit lakes and water features. We had various leach pads here, and these were all cyanide leach pads. We needed to reclaim them, and essentially we started with a prediction there would not be acid generating. Quickly it was realized they were. So you can see we ended up with about a 4-foot cover, and that cover again is intended to be evapotranspiration cover. Limit the infiltration of moisture, etc., but it isn't an actual engineered or barrier cover in terms of having a liner or other feature. This is just another example. So a lot of this was early on in my reclamation experience, as well as in a lot of other people here in Montana. And a lot of what was done here was really learning to do something in terms of landforms with reshaping it. But it wasn't intentional, and that was something that was somewhat budget limited, I might add. So another mine I want to mention is the Golden Sunlight Mine. And the Golden Sunlight Mine, there have been a lot of contentious arguments, you might say, over the years about the mine. One of those in particular has to do with backfilling the open pit. That argument never really actually went through. And they won't backfill that pit, but there's a lot of interesting reclamation features at this mine. In the foreground, you can see 2 tailings impoundments. And one of those tailings impoundments is reclaimed. That's the earlier tailings impoundment. And then the more current tailings impoundment that still continues to be used is on the right in the foreground. Surrounding those tailings impoundment, I might mention, are 63 different wells, groundwater control wells. The Zortman mine that I previously showed you was one of the first mines where we knew there was going to need to be groundwater treatment in perpetuity for acid mine drainage. The Golden Sunlight Mine is really the first mine that an EIS acknowledged that was going to happen as a consequence of its mining. And so a lot of what I ended up dealing with is issues from acid mine drainage, going into groundwater and surface water, the mitigation required for that, and the long-term closure, water management and other treatment requirements for that. Now, one of the things that we did at the Golden Sunlight Mine that was really a learning lesson for everybody involved, and the lesson actually extends out throughout the Western U.S. as well as elsewhere, was dealing with steep slopes. And we learned that when you're actually working with steep slopes, you can do it in terms of equipment, safety, various other things. But unless you have a good percentage of coarse material, and I'm talking material that's 3 or 4 inches plus, you end up having too much erosion and essentially compromise any material you put on top. So golden sunlight is one place where when you now read reclamation prescriptions throughout the country, what you see is a requirement for a certain amount of coarse material, particularly where we have these very coarse covers. And this is about a 2-to-1 slope here at the steepest over on the left-hand side. And you can see that essentially this was constructed a few years before this next picture, which shows the actual cover, the same cover, after about 4 or 5 years. And at this point, this is a 2-foot cover on top of topsoil-like material. I want to make sure I don't claim it to be topsoil, but it's growth medium. And then you have about 2 foot of non-acid generating material. And then you have acid generating material underneath it. And one of the things we were looking for is how roots extend, various other facets. Also, whether we had acid generating material creeping up into the upper layers because of the way we had convection and things occurring through water at this site. Whoops, sorry, I just think it went way forward on me. Now it's creeping. Okay. Yeah. So I want to switch for a minute to New Mexico. And one of the things that's interesting for me is a lot of the work I did during the past 25 plus years, I would work 1 or 2 weeks in Montana and then suddenly find myself working the next 1 or 2 weeks in New Mexico, and had a number of different projects in both states going on. And that was somewhat, I continued my itinerant engineering nature over the last 25 years as well. The Chino mine is in the southern part of the state of New Mexico, and it's a very large mine. A lot of the mines I've dealt with over the years are very large. This is the open pit that exists there, one of the larger open pits in the southern U.S. And the thing I wanted to let you kind of consider in New Mexico is when you deal with reclamation, one of the things you look at is a lot of different climates, a lot of different aspects. New Mexico doesn't have a lot of vegetation. What it does have is really big thunderstorms. And when you look at this picture, we've actually gone through reclamation at the Chino and Tyrone mine in New Mexico 2 times in most cases, 3 times in others, because attempts at doing reclamation without a lot of experience and without incorporating geomorphic landform design, which we'll talk about later, resulted in reclamation being blown out. And when you look over here on the right, you can see kind of a combination of white stripes and then brown, which is soil. And it's bouncing around a little bit on me. When you look at that picture, what you might realize is the white stripes, that's your stormwater channel. And that's all filled with gravel, etc. And then in between that, you have areas of soil. Well, to try to mimic what happens with stormwater events, you almost end up with stormwater channels of the same size and width, if you will, as soil in between them. And so this is kind of a very questionable approach, but it's one of these that you see a lot. And I've worked with folks trying to figure this out in the southern U.S. This is just another example of the reclamation that's done there using some of that same approach. And then you can see this is the Tyrone mine, and very much the same situation here, where you have these very large stormwater channels running down the slope. And I'm going to talk the next example about why that's not a great idea, and how in the same state, some of the same situations, we're now doing something much different. But a lot of my work over the last 25 years has dealt with how to deal with stormwater. And geomorphic reclamation, again, offers some very big opportunities and differences in how we've typically done that, as we'll talk about towards the end. Now, the mica mine in New Mexico is one of my favorite mines, if you will, certainly one of the favorite clients I had to work with over the years. And it's mine. I actually got to be very involved in the actual reclamation and closure design as well as doing the reclamation and closure. It's a mica mine located in northern Mexico, very close to the Picaries Pueblo, about 5 miles from the Picaries Pueblo. And I know that because I've walked from the Pueblo up to the mine. The Picaries Pueblo traditionally used the area for part of their micaceous clay gathering. And then essentially what happened, not indifferent to a lot of things, in the 1960s, because their clay deposit was located on Forest Service land, a mining operation actually went and said, hey, we want this clay and we want to use it for all kinds of industrial purposes and other things. And so beginning in the 1960s, the mining company moved in and essentially the Pueblo was excluded from the site. Beginning essentially in the 1990s to present, they had lost all access, and really, from a cultural standpoint, that was a pretty big issue. When you look, this is some of the pottery that they make, and the unique thing about the Picaries pottery is the micaceous clay that they gathered from this site. This shows a photograph that occurred about 2 days after I took a walk with the chairman of the tribe, Richard Mermejo. He's the one pictured in the hard hat and braids here. Up to the site. And he showed me at basically the boundary of the site where you could see these very small pits that the Pueblo had used over the years to gather clay. And then all of a sudden here, these great big waste rock piles and various other things. There was a lot of contention between the mining company, and this photograph probably captures that as well as any I could. Essentially, that's Richard talking to the mine manager. And you can see a bit of animosity there and other things going on. Well, the irony is the mine went bankrupt, and I worked with some other folks in New Mexico. We got some money, and we bought the mine out of bankruptcy. And we also agreed when we bought the mine out of bankruptcy to do the reclamation. That all seemed like a pretty good idea until the first day I walked up to the mine. This is a picture of what the site was like in April 2006. After the deal had been made, after I and another gentleman basically said, oh yeah, we can do this for $600,000. We can make it all look good and conform with state and federal regulations. Not when it's got water everywhere. Had an open pit, wasn't supposed to have a pit lake. Sure enough, it did have a pit lake. And you might notice the material at the head of this pit lake. Well, that's the waste material. This mine was a mica schist and very friable, almost working. It was worse than sand in terms of had no cohesiveness, really was going to be a problem in terms of erosion. This is just another indication of site. And you can see the site had a lot of erosion already occurring on it. It had been abandoned, and we essentially needed to figure out what to do with it. Just another picture of all the lakes on top of the waste rock dumps. But the good news was 5 or 6 years later, we had the reclamation done. And this is actually some pictures from the post-reclamation tour that we took in 2011. And you probably can't see it real clearly, but if you look next to the road, you can see the furrows that are present. And these furrows are very important from a reclamation revegetation standpoint, and if you understand what we call niche ecology. This is a picture of the same thing from a distance. And again, you can see that instead of the downhill sloping features that you saw at the Chino and Tyrone mines, there are these cross contour features. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see those with the arrow that I have going across. But the idea is all of that breaks water as it comes down the slope, but it also provides niche habitat for different types of vegetation. You want trees in one place, you want bushes in another, grasses, forbs, shrubs, and various other areas. And you want to be intentional about that in terms of creating places for those things to grow. When you do that, you can get a product that begins to look like it's supposed to, as well as have an irregular surface. And so one of the things that I've seen evolve over time and is now recognized as a principle in a lot of places is the idea of very irregular surface. We're not growing corn. We don't want a smooth surface. And these cross contour furrows that you see allow for this kind of niche habitat to occur that encourages a lot of different kinds of vegetation. And one of the ways that I always felt we were successful at Pickeries was the tribal elders had given us a list of medicinal plants that they wanted to see growing at the site. And 5 or 6 years later, we were able to take a tour with them, and they were actually able to identify, to my pleasure, all the different kinds of plants we were growing that they could and would be able to use in the future. So again, I pointed out also that revegetation, I think, is a very important part of what we do in any kind of reclamation. So want to switch to another mine site just to give you some idea of how bad things can be, if you will, and complicated. And this is the Cuesta mine site in New Mexico. This is in northern New Mexico, where the other mines I've been showing, Chino and Tyrone, are in southern New Mexico in terms of very, very large mine sites. But as the crow flies, this mine site is only about 20 miles from the Pickeries Pueblo mine that I just showed you. Now, I began working on this mine site in 1998, and the first reclamation really didn't begin to occur until probably about 2021. That's what Superfund does. Whereas at the U.S. Hill site, it took us a couple of years to get permitted. We did the work and proceeded. Superfund can take tens of years, if not decades, when that happens, and this site became a Superfund site. This picture shows all these different waste rock piles, and there essentially were 7 different waste rock piles at this site. And then to complicate things a little bit more, you can see down below in yellow and the symbol 38. Well, that's Highway 38 between Red Rock, New Mexico and Cuesta, New Mexico. And you can see the highway goes right underneath the waste rock piles, particularly here. And then we have the Red River, also in the same valley, right next to the road and heading up these waste rock piles. So it really presented some interesting challenges. This is the only place in this presentation I've actually included any numbers and figures, and that's intentional because I didn't want to go into that tonight. But the thing why I didn't include this was to show you that the maximum height, when you look at this second column here on these waste rock piles, there are waste rock piles at the site as high as 1,500 feet from top to bottom, 1,200 feet, 1,100 feet. Most of the piles are greater than 1,000 feet. And that's a lot of verticality, if you will, to deal with in reclamation. We actually ended up realizing we had different climates and climate zones within these different elevations, given the fact we were in a valley. Well, we spent a lot of time at Cuesta trying to figure out how to reclaim that site and not impact the road and the river. And when we did things like a traditional 3-to-1 regrade option, what you would see is we really couldn't reclaim much. When you look here, the reclamation is this green that's done right on top of here. So if we wanted to do kind of what everybody considers the best thing, 3-to-1 reclamation at the site, we actually couldn't get much done. This shows 2-to-1 reclamation, and you can see how we added quite a bit of area that's been resloped. And you can see the idea in this cartoon drawing of it being revegetated. And so by doing steeper slope reclamation, even though it's counterintuitive, it actually allowed us to do a lot more reclamation on a lot more slopes, at least at this particular mine. We also did things like putting in gravity walls at the bottom. That's kind of an engineering approach, that something you could do to try to keep this further away from the road and the river. And then ultimately, what we came up with was this overall integrated conceptual design concept. Now, a lot of the time we spent at Cuesta was trying to figure out, can we do geomorphic design? Because if you knew the site, this is one of the most erosive environments that I've ever been in. These are basically geologic scar areas around and surrounding the mine. And what we really came to the conclusion of is we were going to be lucky if we could do any reclamation at all. In terms of trying to find places to reslope and regrade. And so this was the concept that went forward beginning in about 2016. And then after another 5 years of the EPA and the company and everybody arguing, they finally started doing actual regrade at this site. And so the actual grading of the great big slopes and other things has proceeded. There's actually one large area done and others are going on now. And one of the things that was very interesting, because certainly wasn't part of the original design, um, was this cross contour intervals that you can see. And so if you look closely, you can see that they've actually created cross contours as part of this design in order to break up sheet flow going down this. Now, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but it's something just to let you know. Now, I would not call this a true geomorphic design, though, because when you look, you've got a whole bunch of straight lines in an area that basically is very mountainous and very curved. And so it has issues, but it's one of those things where sometimes all you can do at best is improve the vegetation, and you may have to be stuck with the larger landforms. Okay, so let's return back to Montana for a few minutes. The Upper Clark Fork Basin Superfund sites, if you've never had a chance to spend a day and actually wanted to spend something that may sound wacky to go look at mine reclamation sites, but you would never have a better opportunity to really go and see a lot of different things that have been done. They're very innovative. There are things that give one thought as to what reclamation and restoration and some of these things that we're talking about actually mean. One of the areas is the tailings disposal areas. And this is an area that I worked on with Sarah Zuzalak and some other folks. Um, it's over 10,000 acres of tailings right next to Anaconda, Montana. And when we first got there, my firm and the folks that worked with, working for the county in 2006, essentially none of this area had been reclaimed. The county, as well as EPA and ARCO, had been in kind of an endless war, if you will, over who should do what and how it should be done. Well, on the right-hand side, you can see photograph of a dust storm. And what I did was work with the county as well as various citizen groups and others, and we raised hell with EPA in particular, but also with Atlantic Richfield Company, and ultimately got everybody to agree to and begin to implement a remediation plan for the opportunity ponds. And today, all 10,000 acres are remediated. The 10,000 acres are being used primarily as wildlife habitat and open space, also for recreation and other purposes. And it is something to really see the difference in terms of how that area looks today versus how it looked beginning in 2006 and going back. Now, if you also are just happening to drive by Butte, when you get past Butte, you go through the little town of Rocker. You can take a side road off Rocker and go down to what we call streamside tailings. And Silverbow Creek, which is the connecting creek from Butte to Anaconda and then further down into the Clark Fork River Basin, essentially it was dead from its initiation in Butte all the way down past Warm Springs Ponds. And to the degree you could find life, it might be a few water bugs and other things, as Sarah can attest to and knows. And it was one of the, how should I put it, more devastating situations I'd ever run into in terms of how much tailings was there and how difficult this was going to be to restore. Well, it is one of the best places to go to see how you do it. And I'd say even how you do it right. This picture up here on the top, what you see is a bypass channel was constructed. And the entire stream was taken out of the original channel, put up in the bypass channel, which then allowed for excavation of all the tailings down in the basin. Originally, EPA and ARCO wanted to leave a lot of this material in various piles they were going to push up all through the basin. Well, a lot of folks said no, including Montana DEQ, citizens group I work with, and we got them to do a complete removal. You can see the bottom picture is from actually the same bend in the creek after it was all restored. And this is, as I say, one of the best restoration jobs. And when we talk restoration, it really is building back in the natural ecosystem. That's what they've done with streamside tailings, Silverbow Creek. And again, it's a good example when we talk about restoration. Also, restoration in Montana, and one of the best examples I can think of is the Milltown Dam removal. And I enjoyed the opportunity to be very involved in this process of uh, getting them, the agencies, to actually agree to remove Milltown Dam. If some of you remember, it took a flood event in 2014 to really push the issue, or excuse me, not 2014, in 2004, to really push the issue because they almost ended up losing the dam. And then they realized, well, if we're going to lose it sooner or later, I guess we've got to get it out now. You can see the dam feature that had been there since the early 1900s. And behind that dam, there had been all kinds of sediments contaminated with arsenic, other metals behind the dam. And so what they did there was, again, put in a bypass channel uh, on the left-hand side. As you can see, they're constructing that there. Went ahead and channeled the river around all these sediments, removed the sediments. And then you can see over on the right-hand side, the actual restored channel between the Black Fork River and the Clark Fork River. And so essentially, we restored the original confluences of the two streams. And it's been one of the major projects, I think, in terms of dam removals and restoration, particularly when you get to upper reaches of rivers that are out there. I have to mention the Smelter Hill and Old Works Golf Course. We oftentimes hear the idea of redevelopment occurring at these mine sites. And while it is an attractive idea to do something like build a golf course, one of the things I can tell you after having worked for the county and really analyzed this golf course very carefully, it was going to cost the county $3 or $4 million a year to keep this golf course there. And unless it was doing a lot for them economically elsewhere, that really didn't make sense. Had a lot of different discussions actually about just letting Atlantic Richfield shut it down, EPA take it over, whatever. They did end up giving the county a fairly good trust fund that hopefully they'll keep and spend wisely in order to continue doing the maintenance, because a lot of times what you think is going to make you money doesn't work that way. Another thing that I've been working on a lot and seeing at mine sites, at least proposed, not oftentimes actually done, is this idea of producing solar energy or wind energy from mine sites. And in theory, it makes a lot of sense because you've got all this infrastructure coming into mine sites that if you just go ahead and reverse things, it'll go out. The difficulty, and this is a good example here, is where you put in these solar sites, you now don't have revegetation. And so once these solar sites are gone, you're going to need to revegetate and otherwise manage the tailings that are underneath them. And so you get into all kinds of different aspects that you have to think of with development on mine sites that you wouldn't have thought about otherwise. And then finally, before I go to geomorphic reclamation, just wanted to touch on mine land regeneration, in part because my good friend Paul always talks about it, and I've had to spend a little time trying to get my head around it. An interesting thing is when you look at the use of the word regeneration on a global aspect, it really is used to just talk about reclamation in the same way we've talked about otherwise. However, a key part of it is it looks very carefully at the plant communities, the soil communities, and the other aspects of what goes on, and really applies agricultural science in various ways to the question of how best you get that land returned to a useful, productive state. In the United States, at least for modern mines, we require reclamation of topsoil, or you have to save all your topsoil and put it in a stockpile so you can use it for reclamation later. Well, in a lot of situations, there isn't any topsoil. In other situations, they simply may not have saved the topsoil or it wasn't required. So you have to look at other approaches. And where I actually got into this more than anything was doing work in the Philippines, where I couldn't figure out why everybody was mad at me for wanting to reclaim the land and fence it off and grow a bunch of plants. They wanted to go back and farm on top of that land. And I had to rethink a lot about how I approach reclamation because of that. The most common way to go about this whole approach is regenerative grazing. And it's something that has been, I think, very successful on coal mine lands, both in the US as well as in places like Australia. There are even examples of where you do something like growing crops, alfalfa or other feed on top of mined lands such as tailings, etc. And it is something to definitely give consideration in this whole kind of picture. Okay, I'm going to finish up with landform reclamation. Need to take a quick sip of water here. So I first ran into this whole concept back in about 2006. And I went to a conference and there was this guy, Horst Shore, and he's one of the authors of Landforming, the book that I'm showing on the right-hand side. And I might draw your attention to the title picture on this title page. And you might notice the Hollywood sign up on the right-hand side and say, well, what in that, what in the heck is that doing here? And how does that relate to landforming in this discussion? Well, Horst Shore, where he really comes into the picture is when they first were developing subdivisions and shopping malls and various other things in the Los Angeles area, particularly in the Hollywood Hills and other kind of the hill area around LA, they were basically getting blown out. They would build the subdivision or they build the shopping area. 2, 3 years later, a storm event would occur. And because they essentially weren't paying much attention to what nature wanted to do and trying to impose, if you will, their engineering designs on top of that, they were paying the consequences. And so he went in and actually looked at it and said, well, why are we trying to defeat what Mother Nature is trying to do? And rather, why don't we try to blend into that and actually incorporate that in what we do? And so he and this other gentleman, Donald Gray, came up with landforming. I actually got to meet Horst Shore. I doubt he's still alive right now. Really very interesting gentleman to sit down and work with on this whole approach and concept. Now, in a more modern context, it's been taken up by the mining industry, not in, I'm going to say, a lot of folks, but there are practitioners who specialize in it. One of those, and the one I'm most impressed with, is Gord McKenna. He runs the Landform Design Institute in Canada. And they've really incorporated this idea of geomorphic design. Gord is a PE, but one of the things you'll notice if you go to their website, or his website, I should say, is he also is somebody who has an eye for natural forms and natural shapes. He also has a great respect for the input of Indigenous peoples. And I do a lot of work with Indigenous peoples, particularly up in Canada. So he talks a lot about what is landform design and the idea that it's really multidisciplinary. Oftentimes, there are two people who work on reclamation and closure designs in mining applications. The first is a civil engineer, your dirt mover, if you will, and your second is your vegetation specialist. And he's going to tell you what kind of a seed mix to throw out there, maybe whether you should add a little bit of nutrients or something else to your soil. And traditionally, that has been the team, if you will, other than maybe some input from regulators that you might get involved in reclamation. But this very much recognizes that you don't just have the mining industry, but you have to have regulators, communities, and others all work together. And it really can lead to a very positive outcome if you do, or at least a much less negative outcome, I'd say. One of the key things that it recognizes, and again, this really comes back to what I've learned from Northern Plains and how important it is for the designers to have the opportunity to listen. It incorporates the idea of integrated community. It's very important when you do reclamation and closure. And by the way, one of the things I've been amazed with over the last 30 years of my work is when we suddenly say we want to talk reclamation and closure, we get a good audience. The Good Neighbor Agreement is a good example, talking about geomorphic reclamation. Everybody wanted to come, even though the presentation itself wasn't all that great. People were excited about it. It's an incredible opportunity for the mining industry to involve the community in what they're doing. So you want collaboration with local communities, with Indigenous people. You want people to understand and treat it as part of a business or a finance framework. And a lot of this is about people telling you what they think is going to impact them. And spending time, this is very important to me, is spending time and actually thinking about how you could best go about mitigating those impacts. And a lot of times, if you can come up with suitable mitigation, a lot of the opposition uh, seems to disappear in realization that at least you're going to do what you can do to mitigate. There's shared governance. One of the key things I'll tell you that's very difficult in reclamation is getting the regulators to allow not only the company to do the best job they can, but to allow any kind of, if you will, community input or collaboration. They've kind of got their set way they like to do things that meets their regulations, and they're probably one of the folks you have to work with in particular to make sure this idea of shared governance happens. And then, as I say, it's multidisciplinary. You need people to understand things at the large scale, but also, as I mentioned, landform scale, which means being able to see the shapes and forms, the geology, the evolution of that geology as it's been shaped by wind, storm events, catastrophic events, etc. You also need to be able to talk about vegetation, wildlife use of that vegetation, of that habitat, various other aspects. And so again, this multidisciplinary landform design is very much a part. The other thing is to recognize that it's a decades-long progress or process, excuse me. Mines, as many you know, might open and take 5, 10, 15 years before they hit closure, particularly before they hit full closure. The reclamation itself is not a matter of just doing it, waiting a couple of years, and you're done. But it can actually take decades to evolve, to mature, and ultimately, until you get a big storm event, which might take decades to occur, you really haven't tested your design in various other aspects. So it's a process that goes on, and it comes back and repeats itself and reconsiders itself. And that has to be part of what one considers or allows for in this design. The idea is at the end of the day, you try to get everybody to sign off on it. And it's something that you're never going to meet everybody's ultimate satisfaction, but I have seen the success of this in various ways and forms. So again, this is just one more depiction, and I just keep emphasizing this whole idea of landform design team. When you look, again, instead of just two people who really have a very limited view, if you will, of how you do things, you need to include all these different folks, hydrologists as well as ecologists, risk assessors, the idea of actually having an artist get involved and help to draw things out. So you can see pictorially how things work, and so you can address things like aesthetics and vegetation and various other parts. And then when we do this, as an engineer, I have typically would just jump right down into what I'm showing as design, where you're actually designing things and not consider this idea of a vision and goal. And this is where, in a very important way, stakeholder involvement is an integral part of geomorphic design. And when you look at the original articles written by McKenna and others going back to 2007, when you look at Horst Shore and his work, what they talk about is this is the importance of stakeholders, is to create this vision, what needs to be done. As an engineer, as a party working for a company, kind of aloof and independent from the site, you don't have a great vision other than to try to, meet a certain set of regulations or specifications. Including stakeholders is where you get the vision. It's also where you get your goals and what you want to pay attention. So I'm going to show you an example next of what happened at East Boulder when we didn't undertake this process. But the one thing I'll tell you is we really didn't have a good opportunity to incorporate these first two aspects. The process itself was really one that got taken over from a regulatory standpoint. But what I'm going to show you is the first example of where geomorphic reclamation has been recognized as part of a NEPA process and will be part of a record decision and requirement for a company. So what I'm going to talk about is the SMC East Boulder Mine Lewis Gulch Tailings Storage Facility. It's something that folks involved in the Good Neighbor Agreement are very aware of and very involved in. And this is a kind of a geomorphic reclamation case study, if you will. Now, this was the original design that I worked on. Various members of Cottonwood Resource Council, who are part of the GNA councils, also were involved in looking at this design and talking about it. And in terms of it representing typical reclamation best practice at the time, it does so. And what it shows here, these arrows indicate the direction of water flow. And essentially, the design was a mounded tailings storage facility with water flowing over the top and essentially 1, 2, 3, 4 primary drainage channels. And a lot of straight lines. If you look, this is a straight line here. Everything's a straight line here except for the backside where it kind of went along the mountain contour. Well, through the EIS process, the Forest Service took up the recommendations of the councils that a geomorphic design be required for these facilities. Again, that's the first time a federal agency has, or any agency really to my knowledge in the US, has recognized the concept of geomorphic design and also required it to be part of the design going forward. And so the company had to put together a much more detailed design than is typical as part of before the record decision could actually be come out. And I'm showing you some of the work that the company has been working on. So one of the things I mentioned that you look at the pre-development topography, and I mentioned the importance of stormwater and other things. The modern tool and what people are using is what's called a water drop analysis. And it basically looks and breaks up the natural drainages into their different extents, et cetera. And you can see that on the top right-hand side, how intricate, nature lays things out. I'm sorry, I keep bouncing here. In the the red and blue lines, and you can see essentially what nature wants you to do in terms of not having 2 or 3 watersheds, but really trying to break things up. Well, what it led to in terms of looking at how to do this, on the left-hand side is essentially showing what the tailings facility will look like once it's built. Not when it's closed, but once it's constructed. And one of the unique things about doing geomorphic reclamation is you need to construct the tailings embankments at its final shape during the initial construction. The Nye tailings facility at the Stillwater mine, for example, or the Nye tailings facility, it was not built with this in mind and really was built without reclamation being part of what was going to be done and just left at those sharp 2-to-1 slopes. Well, the idea is that you can do something quite different and you build it differently. So they have done this design, and you can see there's a lot more shape and watersheds on the outside, and I'll talk about those later. The other thing is, instead of a mounded top, this now has a much more convex top, if you will, and graded top leading to a discharge channel. And the whole idea is, again, to avoid concentration of water, et cetera. This shows some of the embankment grading, and I'm sorry it's not real easy to see, but if you look on top of the brown ground slopes, if you will, you'll see blue lines. And those blue lines actually represent where water would flow off the facility. And again, the idea here is rather than have the water flow off all in one concentrated flow, you really want to do what nature shows is done and try to break that flow up to the extent you can. And so that's part of the idea of what was done in the design that we worked on for the East Boulder mine. The other part that went on was a lot of attention was given to cap grading. And that's both to ensure we get water flow, but also, as it turns out, we have a lot of issues with respect to cap settlement. And when you have these very large tailings impoundments, even after you close them, they're going to continue to kind of settle down. And so by having a very thick cap, you can allow for that. It's one of the reasons why I personally advocate feet, not just feet on top of tailings facilities. This shows the actual thickness that we'll end up with, varying from 4 to 6 feet. And the whole idea here is to allow for this top area to settle and form a much more natural landform. And then kind of a final slide on geomorphic reclamation is when you look at this now in terms of how it's broken up, you can see how many different subcatchments and primary catchments exist on this site now. And we really have taken a site that had 4 different discharges or discharge points, if you will, and created one with approximately 30 different points of discharge and ways that the water will come off of it. There'll also be things like placement of root balls, boulders, various other aspects. As I mentioned to councils, one of the things we'll also look at is dealing with vegetation. So I greatly appreciate your patience and your listening to what I had to talk about, and I'd be glad to take any questions or otherwise.
Jim, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. And I just want to go shout from the rooftops about landform design. Um, I can run back in the in-person room and I'll put any questions in the chat, but does anyone on virtually have a question? Just come off mute and go ahead. While folks are thinking, Jim, I'm wondering what's next for you, or, what do you know of in Montana where this might be applied?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because one of the things about Montana is we have probably had more reclamation and closure work done through Superfund, done through the state DEQ, various other auspices than nearly any other place I can think of. There's still ongoing work, and a lot of what I think is most fascinating in Montana is we're seeing work that's 20 and 30 years old, and we're now seeing whether or not it being what we thought it was in terms of so-called successful reclamation. And what I can tell you is, in a lot of cases, the reclamation that was done some time ago looked very good to initially begin with, but then as time has gone on, it's worn out. So Montana, probably more than any place I know of, serves as a place where we have great examples of reclamation, but also where we have we're learning constantly from that reclamation. But I know basically what I've been doing a lot more myself is realizing and working on the applying the same principles, but globally. And I will tell you that's a challenge in that the way people manage land, you have to listen and understand the differences, but also differences in climate, just the whole overall approach, governmental regulations, various other things is quite interesting. So, but we have set the way, and I would congratulate Northern Plains folks involved in the GNA and others in that site that has had geomorphic reclamation actually recognized as part of the plan and requirements there. And I think that's a big achievement that I hope we find some way to talk about beyond just ourselves.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Thank you
Too
so
late.
much. I know everyone, it's past everyone's bedtime after a late night last night, possibly, but really, really appreciate this. This is going to be recorded, so we'll make sure that we share it with folks that maybe couldn't make it at this time. But excuse me. But yeah, thank you, Jim, and really, really appreciate all the efforts you put into this presentation. Any thoughts? And then we'll just close.
Not on my part. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody again.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, drive safely.
Thanks. Goodbye.